Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen. I'm here with Paul as always. And Paul, we've got an interesting quandary because for years, especially on the conservative, MAGA, whatever you want to call it side, there has not been a lot of respect for then Senator Marco Rubio. Looking at his past as a neocon, standing against many of the things that were on the more conservative side when it came to foreign policy. Now, all of a sudden, he is deemed and dubbed to be the Secretary of State, and he is unanimously confirmed by the Senate. But surprisingly, in just his first few weeks, it appears that he may actually be a decent diplomat. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion. And you got some thoughts and insights, and especially some things he's said in some interviews that really are refreshing when it comes to the United States and foreign policy.
Yeah, well, thanks obviously for joining today as well, Ken. It's great when we get together. And yeah, Rubio's never been a favorite of mine. In fact, I've pretty much disliked everything Rubio's ever said. But okay, we have to be careful that we don't place too much credence on words. It's always, words are meaningless. It's his actions and what he actually does. But there was a recent interview he did on, I think it's Sirius XM, and it was with Megyn Kelly. And I think it's interesting. They discussed a whole raft of points to do with foreign policy, unsurprisingly. And he came out with some very telling statements. Does it ultimately mean a massive policy change for the United States in terms of their foreign interaction with other countries, etc.? I don't know. And at this point, it would be foolish to suggest that those words do suggest that, but in isolation, the words do tend to make us think, hang on, is there going to be a big policy shift in the US? Now, okay, setting aside all the sort of gung-ho issue with the tariffs, and we'll do a podcast soon on the tariffs in more detail as to what's gone on. It was interesting because he came out and was basically talking initially about, I think we spend a lot of time in American politics debating tactics like what we're going to do, who we're going to sanction, what letter we're going to send. He said, and I think it really has to start with strategy. Well, that would be true if that was indeed the case. He said, so what is the strategic objective? What's the purpose, the mission? He says, and I think the mission of American foreign policy, and this may sound sort of obvious, well, it does to no doubt everyone who's listening, and to Ken and I, that it's been lost. The mission of US policy is long since been lost. And he said the interest of American foreign policy is to further the national interest of the United States. But the question is, what does that mean? Because historically, the United States in recent decades, foreign policy might be what it perceives to be in their national interest, but ultimately it is proved to be utterly disastrous. I mean, obvious things like Afghanistan and Iraq, Libya, Ukraine, Syria, the list goes on. It's been disastrous. And therefore, the argument is the United States going to actually now start to genuinely think about its policy decisions in the future? That includes obviously strategy, which you'd think would have been plainly obvious to anybody that if you don't have a strategic approach, you're doomed to fail. And he makes another point, then I'll obviously give way to you, Cam, because he said, the way the world has always worked is China will do what's in the interests of China. The Russians will do what's in their interests of Russia. Even says the Chileans are going to do what's in the best interest of Chile, and likewise for the United States. And where our interests align, that's where you have partnerships and alliances. Well, yes. And where our differences are not aligned, that is where the job of diplomacy is to prevent conflict while still furthering our national interests and understanding, where other countries will further theirs. He said, this has been lost. He said it was lost at the end of the Cold War. because we were the only power in the world, which is absolutely true. And we assumed this responsibility of becoming this global government, trying to solve every problem. And there are terrible things happening in the world. He says, and then there are things that are terrible that impact our national interest directly, and we need to prioritize those. But he then said, so it's not normal for the world to simply have a unipolar power. He says that was an anomaly. It was this product of the end of the Cold War, but eventually you're going to reach back to a point where you have a multipolar world, meaning multiple great powers in different parts of the planet. He says we face that now with China and to some extent Russia. So I think he again underestimates Russia, which is not a particularly harsh critique because most people do. And then he says we have rogue states like Iran and North Korea to deal with. Okay, so he doesn't refer to China and Russia as rogue states. And he basically refers to the fact that he thinks, or the perception I feel he thinks, is that Iran and North Korea are also emerging powers. And basically, if you take him for, on face value, and okay, maybe people do, maybe they don't, he's effectively saying what we've said for a long time: unipolarity is dead, meaning the end of US as a hegemonic power. And we have to accept the fact the world is now a multipolar world, where there is going to be multiple great powers. In the end, we're going to have more and more of them because the whole world will become more flat in terms of the power structure, for want of a better word. And I think that's extremely telling for somebody in his position to come out, because that's, maybe sometimes it's a little bit too subtle, but it is a recognition and a realization. The world is in the middle of this huge paradigm shift, and we're going to have to change our perspective and attitude with regards to nations in the future, including, of course, China, Russia, etc.
Yeah, it's fascinating because to make those statements the way he did shows an intelligence that I don't think even the American people knew about or had seen for his time in the Senate, because his advisors are pretty much every advisor and official in the government has followed that Wolfowitz doctrine post Cold War, and foreign policy has been predicated and dictated to that. And when it came to the rise of the multipolar world, first they ignored it, and then they, thought they could deal with it with color revolutions or proxy wars or just a number of different things that would try to extend, the unipolar hegemonic system. But to come out and say the different points about the way the world is, and even if he's got a skewed perception of Iran and North Korea, the fact of the matter is that it's a recognition that the world, the United States has stretched itself to like the end of the Roman Empire, and by that I mean their frontiers were too vast, where they couldn't control. Their monetary system, the U.S. monetary system, for all intents and purposes, is insolvent and bankrupt. So what you're going to see is you're seeing cracks in the society, you're seeing cracks in the government. And I think more than anything, since the Secretary of State, the chief diplomat, is supposed to push the views of the president/executive branch, it's almost like what he's trying to do is to salvage something for the U.S., not as an empire, but knowing that the world is changing and that America's place in the world is going to have to change with it. So by changing some of the diplomatic things, like we're going to talk about what he did with Panama, what he's doing with, I think, some of the Central and South American states in regards to his visits there. And then, of course, how they see Russia and China more as partners, because we've already seen this come out from President Trump, and you always have to take everything with a grain of salt, comes out of the mouth of President Trump, because he mentioned that initially, even before he took office, that he wanted to get with China and create this sort of G2, and that it would be a multipolar type of domination over the world. And maybe that, of course, is, I don't want to say bombastic, but it's just ignorant in that thought. But it at least is showing that the Trump administration is thinking more along the lines of multipolarity rather than unipolarity. And the question then has to become, if he's doing this in the first couple of weeks, what really is going to change the first time he gets a chance to meet with representatives from Xi Jinping's administration, or the meeting with Russia? Because a lot of this is going to be done at the Secretary of State level, more than just simply leaders getting together and all the hoopla that comes with that. I think Rubio is going to have the opportunity not to be, our most famous diplomat, I think, in history was John Jay, but that was over 100 years ago. We really haven't had, we could say Kissinger, yeah, maybe, but there was a lot of things he did that really kept the empire going rather than mutual diplomacy between nations. And in this case, I think there is a real opportunity. The world is at a evolution more than a crossroads. And hopefully, what we're seeing early on, Rubio can be a catalyst for taking the bombastic things that come from Trump and churning them into something that is sorry, beneficial to both sides rather than adversarial.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a number of broader points without going into the specifics of individual places that he came to mention. And we've said this point for a long time, that the United States is militarily light years behind the Chinese and the Russians. And China is now making these gigantic strides forward. And we've talked about how this definitely terrifies cooler, sensible heads inside the Beltway, inside the Pentagon, even the intelligence agencies. And he makes reference to the fact that it's the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War this year, which it is. And he said, if you look at the scale and scope of destruction and loss of life, it would be far worse if we had a global conflict now. Said it may be the end of life on the planet. Well, it most certainly would be. And he said, it sounds like hyperbole, but that, you have multiple countries now who have the capability to end life on Earth. So we need to work really hard to avoid armed conflict as much as possible, but never at the expense of our national interest. Well, he's going to have to qualify that. But if you're seriously thinking, well, I don't want to get into conflicts, as we've said, the US never would, with the Chinese, the Russians, or any nuclear power. But yes, of course, you're going to have to maintain your national interest. But what he's basically saying is we're going to have to temper that, because now there are these countries who can cause these enormous massive destruction in terms of the weapons they possess. And it's weapons we know the United States doesn't possess. So he then goes on the back of that to say, we can now have a framework by which we analyze not just diplomacy, but foreign aid and who we would like to line up with. And a word I've very rarely heard in my lifetime associated with the United States, he talks about pragmatism. Well, but by the way, he's saying we don't abandon our principles. He says, I'm not a fan of some horrifying human rights violator somewhere in the world, but by the same token, diplomacy has required us and foreign policy has required us to work in the national interest. But this is interesting. Sometimes in cooperation with people who we wouldn't invite over for dinner, or people we wouldn't necessarily ever want to be led by. And so that's a balance, but it's the sort of pragmatic and mature balance we have to have in foreign policy. So that very much suggests that, look, we have historically referred to nations as adversaries, we refer to nations as rogue nations. But in the future, just so you start to understand, this is for public consumption, we're going to start dealing with these nations in a more mature way. We're not going to just talk about them and make all kind of accusations about them and then try and blame them for everything we think we can pin on them. That's over. We're going to have to be pragmatic, and we're going to have to share the dining table with nations and individuals we're not comfortable with, but welcome to the new world, because that is the only way in the future we're going to be able to adopt a sensible, pragmatic foreign policy. And also in the process, of course, of doing that, we're then going to try and build relations with these kind of adversaries, rogue nations, etc. That's the inference of what he's saying. And now if they do that, that is a monumental shift in US foreign policy without any shadow of a doubt. And just one final point I would say is they're starting to realize, look, a lot of our adversaries are stronger than they've ever been. They're becoming even stronger since the last Trump administration, and he even makes reference to the fact Russia wouldn't consider itself weaker than they were 4 years ago. And he uses the example in Ukraine. Of course, they now control territory they didn't have when Trump left office, which is true. Okay, there's the context of when the war started. So that's basically a tipping their sort of hat to the fact that nations who we think are adversaries are stronger. They're getting stronger. This is part of this big shift in the world. And our policy decisions will have to reflect that. And this is why I keep coming back to the point. The United States will never, ever go to war with Russia directly, or with China because they're nuclear powers, or North Korea because it's a nuclear power now. Iran's questionable whether it is or it isn't. But that's the basis of why, I think from the Rubio perspective, there's some lessons privately being learnt about Ukraine. And we'll come on to the subject of Ukraine. It might be in a different podcast because there's going to be a series of these, because there's a lot to discuss with regards to comments Rubio's made. But I think this is another telling indication of a big change, or at least potentially a big change in US foreign policy.
Yeah, one thing, final thoughts on this subject. It's sort of an American trait for the leaders to be bombastic. And then behind the scenes, you have where diplomacy takes shape. If you remember Ronald Reagan at the very tail end of the Cold War, he referred to Russia as the evil empire. He came on stage and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall." So these things were done, outwardly, publicly, as in that bombastic way to do something. And behind the scenes, it opens the door for diplomacy to take shape. I think a lot of nations are content to just be at the status quo. If they're corrupt, whether they're corrupt or whatever, if they have weak leaders, they really need some type of push, something to fire them up, wake them up, to be willing to come to the table and make change. Change is hard. Change is difficult. And I'm not condoning the American way, but historically, that's really been the way we do it. The leaders make bombastic statements, and then diplomacy, hopefully like the Jim Bakers of the world, will come together and make an agreement that was at least suitable for the collapse of the Soviet Union. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion and for your insight.
Yes, and likewise. And obviously, we're going to follow this up with part 2, maybe 3, I don't know, 4. There is an awful lot to chew through with regards to statements that Rubio's made.
Absolutely. And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for all of your ongoing support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.